I'd like to welcome everyone to this special evening panel conversation honoring Pope Benedict. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the president and founder of the Hildebrand Project. And before I will introduce our panel in a moment and say a word about the flow of our evening. We look forward to engagement from those of you who are here with us. And we'll do that by using the chat feature the Q&A feature here in Zoom. So if you have questions, please send them through the Q&A feature. You all can certainly chat amongst each other, but we'll be looking for your questions in the Q&A feature. So I'm delighted to be joined here by three very dear friends and also people who are very close to us here in the Hildebrand Project. We'll hear first from Professor Crosby, who is a professor of philosophy here at Franciscan, actually professor emeritus of philosophy at Franciscan University, a co-founder of the Hildebrand Project, a student of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and a disciple of John Paul II, who will be speaking first. Then we'll hear from my dear friend, Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, a member of the Hildebrand Project Board of Trustees. He's the senior director at the Tikvah Fund and the dean of the Tikvah Summer Institute, which takes place at Yale University. And we're delighted to have Mark with us to speak about Pope Benedict. And I would encourage any of you who have not seen it, he's written a wonderful piece on Pope Benedict for Public Discourse. And finally, last but not least, we have Father James Brent with us, professor of philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and we're very happy to say also an associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project and a great friend and intellectual collaborator. So I'm so grateful to the three of you for being with us. Before turning it over to you all and hearing your remarks, I just thought it would be worth sharing with our audience a little bit of the history of the relationship between first Joseph Ratzinger and then Pope Benedict with the Hildebrand Project. There's a very real way in which the Hildebrand Project may not exist today, but for his generous and continuous support of our work from the very beginning. And I just want to share a little bit of that. A fuller account of it I've written can be found on the webpage of the Hildebrand Project. I've written a kind of autobiographical account of the various encounters we had with him and the various moments in his support of our work. And so anyone who's interested, I would encourage you to go and look at that on the website. But let me just sort of bring you all to some pivotal moments. So when the project was first founded in 2004, I was a much younger person with no gray hair, and I have some now. And I didn't know a lot, but I knew that it might be good to bring in some eminence. And so Alice von Hildebrand had the wonderful idea of inviting a certain Joseph Ratzinger. And she did, and the letter went in her name. And I came to realize that things were almost stereotypically German there in the offices of Joseph Ratzinger, and that the response came very quickly. And he said initially that he would not rule out something honorary, but given his role in the church, he couldn't join our advisory council. And so we wrote back and said, well, we hereby appoint you honorary member. And he wrote back and said, I happily accept. And then to fast forward, he becomes Pope. I'm a little disappointed, though mostly happy, because I thought, well, there goes our thriving collaboration with Joseph Ratzinger. But we get a grant from the Papal Foundation, which is at the very beginning of our project. We had very little money, and we get this grant. And then I see the Holy Father in 2006 at a Wednesday audience in Rome. And I say to him, thinking that I will be informing him of his gift, Holy Father, thank you for your support through the Papal Foundation. And he looks at me and he said, Das habe ich selber durchgeführt. I put that through myself. And I was stunned. I was not prepared for this, and I didn't know what to say. So all I could say was that Alice von Hildebrand sends her greetings, and he asked of her health. And his concluding remark was, she is a noble lady. So I went back and told this to Alice von Hildebrand, who was a very modest person, but was impressed by this esteem of the Holy Father. And out of this was concocted the idea that perhaps he would see us privately in an audience in which we could talk more about the work. And so she wrote to him. And again, within a few weeks, a letter comes back and says, I'd be happy to see you. Here are 3 dates. Pick a date. So we have a memorable encounter that I've written about in my in what you can read on the website. And I have to say, it almost didn't come to the conversation about the Hildebrand project because our wonderful Alice von Hildebrand had a long agenda of things that she needed to discuss with the Holy Father. And I knew time was ticking. And finally, she says, "Holy Father, I have spent my life fighting feminism." And I said, "Holy Father, she spent her life promoting her husband, which is why we're here." And suddenly we were back on track. And what I didn't know is that the privilege of a private audience, that's the privilege. You don't ask for anything else. But I was young and dumb, and I thought, well, of course you ask for something. Why are we here if not to discuss what he could do? And so I said, "Holy Father, your support is well known, but what if our donors could feel that they were collaborating with you? Would you write a letter of support and explain why you think our work is important?" And he said, "I'd be happy to. Send me a letter." So send him a letter I did, and within maybe 5 weeks, there's a knock at my door, and there's a courier from the nunciature in Washington, and there was the letter, the promised letter. And I bring us to the point of this letter today because the letter anticipates some of the themes that you'll hear in our conversation today, and it shows the great intellectual and spiritual affinity that Pope Benedict had with the Hildebrand project, both out of his deep regard for Dietrich von Hildebrand, but also in respect to the personalism of Pope Benedict, which is in a way the uniting theme of all of the presentations tonight. So I just wanted to briefly read a few lines from this letter. And in fact, I'm going to share it here on the screen. This was in 2 pages, and you can't quite appreciate it here in the PDF, but it's beautifully folded, and this seal that you see there on top is embossed, and everything about it was quite striking. And so the letter speaks, of course, of our meeting. And then he says here that drawing from the inspiration from the Augustinian tradition and its Thomistic reception in light of the Aristotelian philosophy, then Hildebrand sought to advance that tradition by creatively reinterpreting it in the context of modern thought and its concerns. He was far from a petrified vision of the teaching of Thomas based on a narrow and uncritical devotion to the words of the master, and he could well make his own the classic dictum. This is, of course, the line about Plato. Plato is dear, but truth is dear. Here it says, Thomas is dear, or Thomas is my friend, but the truth is even my greater friend. He goes on to say, "Is this legacy which has motivated your project, grounded in the rich philosophical movement which stretches from the pre-Socratics through Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus to Augustine, Thomas, and the great thinkers of the modern age, and taking up the challenge set forth in the encyclical Fides et Ratio, the Dietrich von Hildebrand Legacy Project aims to enter into reasoned dialogue with contemporary currents of philosophy, bringing the full scope of reason to bear on fundamental human questions and contributing to the recovery of the sapiential dimension inherent in the Philosophia Perennis." And here, in a way, moving more directly into the work of Christian evangelization, or simply evangelization for the truth, he says, "Without such a commitment to philosophical enterprise, Christian faith would fall prey to a fideism which would deprive it of its grandeur as man's free submission of intellect and will to the splendor of God's truth, and gravely compromise its missionary dynamism, whereby believers are called to offer to all a reasoned account of the hope that is within them. I therefore express my appreciation and support for the work of the project and my confidence that this praiseworthy initiative will bear abundant fruit for the evangelization of contemporary culture." So this letter, I have to say, has been a kind of constitution for the Hildebrand project in many respects. It obviously sets us in a broad context, really within the immense context of the entire Western tradition, within the tradition of Christian thought. But it evokes also these other great themes in Pope Benedict, the sapiential dimension of reason, the richer sense of reason that Mark will be speaking about, and of course also the role of the pursuit of truth in religious life against this risk of fideism. So we are immensely grateful for what Joseph Ratzinger has done for the world and the church and for so many people. We're also in a very, very special way grateful for the gifts that he gave to us at the Hildebrand Project. And it is with this spirit of gratitude that we honor him this evening with our conversation. So having hopefully given everyone a little bit of a sense of the context of this very special relationship that we had with the late Holy Father, I turn it over now to Professor Crosby to begin our remarks.
Good. Thank you, John Henry. And I might just before starting um, remind everyone that today, January 26th, is the 46th anniversary of the death of Dietrich von Hildebrand. He died on January 26th, 1977. So we remember him with affection and gratitude today. Now, for my comments on the legacy of Benedict XVI, I've chosen from his writings a passage on joy, on the Judeo-Christian religion as a religion of joy. And what he says is not only wise and true, but at the same time, it is a truth that nourishes the spirit. So at least I have always found this essay on joy. Now he begins by acknowledging the accusation of people like Nietzsche that Christians are devoid of joy. In Christians, we too often experience, quote, the joylessness, the cramped scrupulosity, the narrowness of spirit that seems to us to be the most telling refutation of the joyful religion that Christianity claims to be. End of that quote. Nietzsche thinks that we have to break away from Christianity to find joy. In the cross of Christ, he can only see gloom. Now, Benedict gives particular attention to one way in which joy is blotted out of the hearts of Christians. So he gives that particular attention here in this essay. They adhere to a kind of bad altruism, according to which having a self is run together with being selfish. This implies that you can become selfless in the morally positive sense only by extinguishing your distinct self. This means that you let go of aspirations, desires, and hopes and loves of your own, and you try to make yourself as indifferent to them as possible. Dietrich von Hildebrand calls this a kind of religious nihilism. Benedict sees here a kind of self-hatred that afflicts many Christians. He quotes the line from the end of the book of Bernanos, The Diary of a Country Priest, the line, "It is easier than one thinks to hate oneself." And yet, Christianity claims to be a religion not of self-hatred, but of great joy. At the Nativity of the Lord, the angels announce tidings of great joy. Benedict takes this expression to be emblematic of the joy that lives at the center of Christian existence. But how do Christians awaken to this joy and drive out the demon of self-hatred and give the lie to critics like Nietzsche? Benedict formulates the challenge like this, quote, "Is it good that I exist? Is it good that anything at all exists? Is the world good?" How many people today would dare to affirm this question from the heart, to believe that it is good that they exist? Benedict seems to suggest not many. Now he begins his answer to this challenge by saying that this sense of the goodness of my existence grows out of a fundamental self-acceptance. Many of you know how Kierkegaard speaks about self-acceptance when he speaks of the will to be the self that one is, and contrasts that with the refusal to be the self that one is. The self-acceptance is not to be confused with selfishness. Benedict says that would be to fall into the bad altruism just mentioned. You can see the difference like this. A saint grows in self-acceptance even as his selfishness dies away. It is this self-acceptance, Benedict says, that strikes at the root of self-hatred. But how do we achieve this self-acceptance? Benedict says something very profound about achieving it. I cannot give it to myself. I must receive it from another. And I quote again, by ourselves we cannot come to terms with ourselves. Our I becomes acceptable to us only if it has first become acceptable to another I. We can love ourselves only if we have first been loved by someone else. End of the quote. I cannot, he means, accept myself in solitude. Real self-acceptance is mediated by a prior acceptance of me by another. And then Benedict goes deeper and says, if an individual is to accept himself, someone must say to him, it is good that you exist. Must say it not with words, but with that act of the entire being that we call love. For it is the way of love to will the other's existence and at the same time to bring that existence forth again. End of the quote. The wonder of it is that it takes another person to bring forth my existence. I cannot do it by myself. But we are not yet at the deepest root of joy in the telling of Benedict. There is a relation to truth that, let me say it like this, there is a relation to truth that still must be established. He says, quote, is it true then when someone says to me, it is good that you exist? Is it not possible that that person's love that wills my existence is just a tragic error? If the love that gives me the courage to exist is not based on truth, then I must in the end come to curse the love that deceives me, that maintains an existence, something that were better destroyed. End of that quote. Now, to answer this question, where the grounding truth of joy derives from, he turns to revelation. I quote again, God finds man so important that he himself has suffered for man. The cross, which was for Nietzsche the most detestable expression of the negative character of the Christian religion, is in truth the center of the Evangelium, the good tidings. The cross, Benedict continues, is the approbation of our existence, not in words, but in an act so completely radical that it caused God to become flesh and pierce this flesh to the quick. But if, he continues, God so loves us, then we are loved in truth. Then life is worth living. It follows that a human being who says to us how good it is that you exist is participating in God's approbation of our being, and so is loving us in truth. So whoever receives this truth, and not just in a purely intellectual way, but in such a way as to be pierced by it, penetrated by it, lives in joyful self-acceptance. That is the affirmation of this inspired essay of Pope Benedict. Now, toward the end of this essay, Benedict surprises the reader by bringing up the subject of having a sense of humor. He says, deep joy of the heart is also the true prerequisite for a sense of humor. And he explains, the Christian sense of humor springs from the liberating certainty of being ultimately accepted. Then he says something important about how this humor gets integrated into our lives. He says, humor, quote, should really be the way in which the joy of the Evangelium shines unobserved in the routine of daily life, in the humorless harshness of the technological world. End of that quote. And I will now conclude with the sentences with which Benedict concludes this meditation on joy. He says, where joylessness reigns, where humor dies, the Spirit of Jesus Christ is assuredly absent. But the reverse is also true. Joy is a sign of grace. One who is cheerful from the bottom of his heart, one who has suffered but not lost joy, cannot be far from the God of the Evangelium, whose first word on the threshold of the New Testament is rejoice. So that is my meditation on Benedict's meditation on joy. So, John Henry, I think
Now we will hear from
pass it on to Mark. Yeah.
Rabbi Gottlieb.
Thanks so much, John Henry. And it is an absolute pleasure and joy and honor to be with all of you this evening or this afternoon, wherever you may be tuning in from. It's a particular joy and honor to be on this panel with my esteemed friend and colleague, John Henry, with my teacher and revered friend, Professor John Crosby, and my new friend, Father James. If you haven't figured this out yet, I'm the odd man out in the following sense. I'm bringing to you words of celebration and real appreciation of the legacy and thought of Pope Benedict XVI from your Jewish brothers and sisters, at least one Jewish brother tonight, because I think the legacy of Benedict XVI, obviously first and foremost as the father of the church, his impact was quite decisive in so many ways in the liturgy and traditionalism, in doctrine as the prefect for the Holy Congregation of Faith. But I think in a very significant way, Pope Benedict is also not just a friend of the Jewish people, but a friend of the West, a friend of the civilization that was spawned by Jerusalem and Athens. And I think it's important for men and women of all faiths, and even of no faith, to acknowledge the profound contribution that Benedict XVI made to the discourse of reason and to the potentialities of reason in a world that denies reason, in a world that wants to shrink the scope of reason, to make reason desiccated, to make reason shriveled up, to make reason more or less irrelevant to human discourse in the public square. And my goal this evening is to just shine a spotlight on one particular episode in the life of Benedict XVI. And this is, while a snapshot and necessarily circumscribed to one event, I think it's representative of his entire, not only his pontificate, but I think his entire worldview as a theologian and as a thinker and as a cultured European, namely the championing of reason. And so I want to take you all back to September 12th of 2006, within a year or so of Benedict's election as Pope. And of course, if you're paying attention to the dates, September 12th, 2006 is 5 years and nearly to the day of those terrible attacks that we identify as 9/11. And Benedict goes back to his academic home in the Bavarian town of Regensburg, where he, for almost a decade, served as a member of the theological faculty at Regensburg and was even the vice president of the University of Regensburg for a couple of years. And he delivers what, by many accounts, is one of the most significant and consequential lectures of the past half century. And many people in the broader world, in the secular world, in the world of popular culture and media, remember the Regensburg Address chiefly for the protests that it spawned, mostly in the Muslim world. And there is a powerful critique of Islam within the Regensburg Address, but it's not a cheap or undignified or certainly not blasphemous critique of Islam in the way that his detractors misrepresented the Pope's thought, but it is a serious philosophical and even theological critique. But I want to set this address in the context of how Pope Benedict begins. And this address, the Regensburg, what we know as the Regensburg Address, is formally called Faith, Reason, and the University, Recollections and Memories. And Pope Benedict actually delivers very powerfully on that promise of memories and recollections when he opens in a very nostalgic way by talking about how the different departments, the different university disciplines, the different departments of history and philosophy and theology were able to commingle and to talk freely and to have fruitful dialogue amongst the different disciplines and amongst the different departments, and that he was prompted to think about how wonderfully civil and how wonderfully humane and how wonderfully reasoned was this state of affairs in the University of Regensburg in the late 60s and early 70s, and how things have really changed. And he says the occasion of this reflection on the salutary benefits of different disciplines, different subject matters, talking freely with one another and engaging in deep discourse was a passage from a Byzantine emperor, the diary or the memoirs of a Byzantine emperor that's recorded where, and here's the citation of the Prophet Muhammad, that violence and faith can never go hand in hand, that violence and true faith are incompatible. And from this assertion, or from this teaching, Benedict then draws a deeper lesson, and that is that reason and philosophy ultimately belong in the discussion of religion and God, and religion and God belongs in the discussion of the university, the seat of reason and the seat of philosophy. And here he invokes what is a kind of, it's not quite a heresy in many ways, although it's certainly, Thomas Aquinas thought it was a terrible philosophical and theological error, that God's will is the most dominant and the most essential and decisive attribute, and that God's will is in some sense prior to and more dispositive than God's reason. And of course, this is a position that we know in the history of philosophy and theology is called voluntarism. Voluntas is will in Latin, and ratio is reason. And there's this perennial challenge or perennial conflict. And it's not just in the Catholic faith, it's in Islam, where voluntarism is essentially the orthodox position, that will is dominant and will can override reason, which would mean that God might command something and then change his mind. God might command something which seems to human morality immoral, but that would not be in any way a contradiction to his reason, to God's reason. And this position is found as a minor key in Judaism as well. All the Abrahamic faiths, all the Abrahamic traditions grapple with this question. Doctrinally, Orthodox Catholic philosophy, certainly in the Thomistic perennial philosophy, rejects voluntarism. And voluntarism remains, as I mentioned, the decisive or orthodox strand within Islam. And that was really the critique that Pope Benedict offered, not Islam per se, but any faith, any philosophy that gives priority to will over reason, because that's where the schism between faith and philosophy can appear and can be drawn from or nurtured. And in addition to this philosophical or theological debate that Benedict invokes, he goes back to that memoir of the Byzantine emperor that violence against the human being is at odds with true religion, that the Catholic faith and the Jewish faith do not believe in evangelization by the sword. Again, a position that at least Orthodox Islam is familiar with, and I'm not going to speak for Islam. I don't speak as a scholar of Islam to say whether that is the right interpretation of Islam, but certainly it's not an unpopular and historically precedented one. But not so for Catholicism, not so for Christianity, not so for Judaism. Again, here you see perhaps Benedict was an important theologian in Vatican II, in the Council, and the ideas about religious liberty and human conscience, things that were very dear to Dietrich von Hildebrand, our teacher, are, I think, in the backdrop as Benedict emphasizes this great teaching that violence and faith can never truly be reconciled. And then Benedict moves to a kind of theology of history, a very fascinating providentialist account of history, where while philosophy is really the legacy of Athens and Greece, there were intimations of this more philosophical commitment already in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, in the book of John, we see it fully reconciled in the opening verse of the book of John, with logos being the key term and becomes incarnate in Christ. In the Jewish tradition, logos is incarnate in the Torah, in the revealed word of God, and in the carnal Israel, in the Jewish people. But Benedict has this interesting providentialist theological account of history where intimations of this philosophical orientation of being, of ontology, of metaphysics was already in a premonitionary kernel form in the Hebrew Bible when God reveals his name as I am, yeah, which in the Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, as I pointed out in this piece that John Henry was kind enough to mention, there's a little reading, a little interpolation that makes it more Greek than Hebrew. And I suggest that the original Hebrew connotes perhaps being, perhaps a kind of ontology or metaphysic, but one that might not be as staid or as non-dynamic as the Greek metaphysic might have it. But be that as it may, Benedict makes the important point that the Hebrew Bible already intimates this philosophical union between faith and proper philosophy, between the word of God and God's wisdom, and also, of course, the will of God and God's wisdom. For Benedict, will and reason cannot be at odds. Will and reason are ultimately, if not identical, of a co-extensive nature. And here is where I think the lessons that Benedict has to offer the West and civilization as a whole, not just the church, but Western man, really comes into play. Because Benedict chronicles the three stages of what he calls the de-Hellenization of Christianity. He's very worried that in an attempt to go back to the pure original Hebrew Bible, the pure word of God, that somehow will undo or will remove, will unspool the layers of logos, of reason that have been attached or have been naturally accrued, organically accrued to the faith over the period of the Hebrew Bible and the early church fathers. The first stage, of course, is for Benedict the Reformation, the return. Luther's cry of sola scriptura returns us to the Bible itself and has pretenses of removing the accretions of philosophy, of systematic theology that are deemed too Greek. But a more embedded form of this de-Hellenization comes in the 19th and early 20th century with liberal theology, the move to liberalize and to demythologize the church, and the movement to humanize and to historicize Jesus, and to take away the doctrines of the church and make them mere instances of mythology. The figure of Adolf von Harnack is a bellwether for this movement of liberalization in Christianity in the late 19th century. But then the final stage is the stage of multiculturalism, the stage of modernity or post-modernity, where in the pursuit of multiculturalism, we lose any common language or common appeal to reason more objectively. And that is a tremendous danger to the very foundations of the university, first and foremost, and by extension, the foundations of the West. Because without a liberating logos, without a logos, a reason that is full and wholesome and rich and expansive to include the most essential elements of the human being, of the human soul, the flights of poetry and spirituality, if we exclude all that and we only limit reason to what is positivistic, what is quantifiable, then we lose our grip on the most essential questions of man. What is our destiny? What is our hope? What is our dream? And that is that third stage of de-Hellenization that suggests in our attempt to deny the priority of one way of thinking, one mode of reality, we delegitimize any and all claims towards objectivity, any and all claims towards a shared reason, to a discourse that can allow different faiths, different ethnicities, different races, different political stripes and traditions to talk. And after all, that's the purpose of a university, is to create a space where different thinkers can use their reason, can argue, can debate in a way that can contain that thought. And the whole hope of public reason is lost. And then we're just returning to tribes. And so Benedict, in a fascinating way, is not only a champion of religion in reason, but he's a champion of reason itself, more so than the learned philosophers and academics living in their towers of postmodernism or their towers of structuralism, or pick your favorite faddish academic theory. All of these theories that deny a way of truth and a way of reason that captures the fullness of man will ultimately dehumanize man. And in place of a university of reason, we'll find a world of struggle and strife and violence. And I think this is a teaching that all human beings, regardless of religion or ethnicity or political belief, should desperately hold on to. And we owe it to Pope Benedict XVI for being one of its most articulate champions.
Thank you, Mark, for your wonderful comments. Father James.
Thank you, John Henry, and thank you to the Hildebrand Project for the invitation. It's a great joy for me to come on with all of you and discuss this great human being, Pope Benedict XVI. And I want to thank the speakers who went before me here for their astute remarks. And some of the things I will say will overlap with some of your points, but I think we all thought it was a sad day when Pope Benedict XVI passed away. He was near and dear to the hearts of so many of us, and it was so formative for a generation, especially of young men coming up in the priesthood. It's an interesting thing. I mean, I'm an associate scholar of the Hildebrand Project. My primary area of research is in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, and there's it's kind of no secret that there are disagreements between the the School of St. Thomas and Ratzinger on various points. And I will talk about some of those things. But before I do, I first want to say I've spoken with many Thomists about Ratzinger and his thought. And the first thing that I should say is that every single one that I've ever spoken to has expressed profound and deep appreciation and gratitude for the person and the thought of Benedict XVI. There's just so many things in common between the School of St. Thomas and Benedict XVI. For example, maybe the big one is the priority of God, a theme that was so dear to Benedict XVI that he mentioned so many times. God is first. God is first in theology, and God is first in human life and in human existence. And when the priority of God is forgotten, theology degenerates, and human existence, human life, human civilization degenerates. That's something that the followers of St. Thomas could wholeheartedly embrace and agree with, especially very eloquent passages that Benedict XVI often spoke about how in theology, the word that the theologian speaks is not something that is born from a construct or from a theory or an account of things that we come up with. It's born from an encounter with a word that precedes us. It's born from receiving the word of God who speaks to us. I mean, the School of St. Thomas could hardly be in greater agreement about that. I mean, that's how St. Thomas understands Sacra Doctrina. God reveals himself, first of all, and we receive his revelation of himself through the word. And then our calling is to remain faithful to the word that's been received, to strive to understand it, and then tell the word as we have received it for ourselves through scripture and the tradition of the church. Another example of a theme that is deeply in common between Ratzinger and the School of St. Thomas would be the harmony of faith and reason. It's something that Ratzinger insisted on so much and that Mark just talked about. Yes, I mean, this would be something like very profound. We could see ourselves as working together along these lines to sort of maintain in the face of a society that's becoming increasingly more irrational or even anti-rational in various ways, holding up reason as something that all human beings have in common, that is capable of truth, capable of knowledge, capable of moral truth, and can serve as a basis for our common life together, regardless of differences we may have about religion, for example. Another example of things in common, deep points in common between Ratzinger and the School of St. Thomas would be that the view that one of the most corrosive movements in our society today is a sort of philosophy of absolute freedom, or a philosophy of freedom without reference to the truth. And Ratzinger had many things to say about how problematical it is to think of freedom without reference to the truth. A freedom, a human freedom that's not guided by truth, by moral norms, is just simply going to be a force for destruction and disagreement. And it has proven to be such over the course of the last several centuries. And Thomists can easily agree with this. Yes, human freedom, in order for it to be a true perfection of a human person, in order to be perfecting of what human beings are, it needs to be led and guided by the truth. Our free choices need to be a response to what is the truth about the good. So those are just some examples of many things that Ratzinger or Benedict XVI and the School of St. Thomas have deeply in common. And many times I have heard the followers of St. Thomas talk about how the writing and the speaking of Benedict XVI is profound, it's clear, and it's beautiful. It's very moving. There's so much there of value and truth, and it's a treasure for the whole church. It really is. All that being said, it's no secret that there's disagreements between the followers of St. Thomas and Benedict XVI. And a good example is the essay that Ratzinger wrote concerning the notion of person in theology. And this is an example of an essay that tends to rub Thomists the wrong way, because in this essay, he sort of contrasts a classical understanding of the person using Boethius's definition of a person. A person is an individual substance of a rational nature, with other notions of the person, specifically relational accounts of the person. And he basically deeply criticizes the traditional account of Boethius. The person is an individual substance. He does not want to say that. And he wants to propose in its place that a person, not only the persons in God, but all persons, even created persons, angels and human beings, are pure relations. So this is the kind of example of an essay that is going to cause controversy and disagreement. So let me just say a few things about maybe why. So in the essay, he outlines these two understandings of person. And on the one view, the Boethian understanding, which he calls Greek in a way, or is basically submerged in Greek thinking, a person is an individual substance. And he thinks that's problematic to say that. He describes substance as being closed off from other things. Each substance is closed off from every other substance or every other being. And so if you think of persons as substances, you're going to think of persons as being closed off from others, living in a kind of isolation, almost as if substance means solipsism or something like that. But there's more, he has more criticism of the Boethian understanding of person. He says that, yes, when you understand a person as an individual substance, if there are relations to others out there or persons out there, those relations are added on to this substance, almost as if they're extras and the person could exist just as well with or without them. Okay, so those are some of his criticisms of the Boethian understanding of person. And he wants to propose an alternative, which is where we start with persons as they are in the Trinity. And in the Trinity, persons do not, as it were, have an individual substance of their own. Rather, each person is a relation to the others, okay, or the other. So the person is a pure relation. Person is, you could say, nothing but relation. The Father is his begetting or generating of the Son, and the Son is his filiation to the Father. And there's nothing more to the Father or to the Son than these very relations themselves. And what Ratzinger wants to do is say that this way of being a person, as we have in the Trinity, or as the Trinity enjoys, we should say, is not just an exceptional situation that just happens to be God's. Rather, it is the exemplar of all persons, and all persons really should be understood along these lines as being pure relations. So what he really wants to say is that once we take into account the fullness of life in God and in the Trinity, and think of persons as pure relations, we can start to reframe our understanding of created persons, particularly human persons, and start to think of human persons as pure relations. We could even say as being relations without being substances. Okay, so that's what he wants to propose, and The reason why Thomists have difficulties with this, there's actually many, many reasons, but just a couple to start off with. To characterize the Boethian definition of persons as being inadequate is problematic for a number of reasons, because it's presupposed in a lot of traditional theological discourse, just for starters. But it also underlies a lot of important positions in bioethics and other disciplines and areas of philosophy. To say that, there's lots of examples we could give, but to say that substances are closed off from others would be an inadequate characterization of substance. It's almost characterizing substances as if like they're solipsistic, like by nature or something like that, but no. And it's also inadequate to characterize relations as merely added on to substances, as if they're adventitious accidents or something like that. In fact, if a person is an individual substance of a rational nature, our relations to other persons aren't just added on to our nature, they spring from our nature. They're proper to persons. It's proper to persons to relate to other persons. So properties flow from the nature of a thing. And so our relations to other persons would flow from within our nature as rational, okay? So persons, even on the Boethian account, are relational, okay? They're just not relations without a substance. They're relational in a way that springs from their very substance, from their very nature, okay? So there's a mischaracterization of the Boethian understanding of personhood. That would be one sort of response to the essay. But another response would be something like this, that the understanding of persons as pure relations, that really is proper to the condition of being in God. And it's not just that we're arbitrarily saying that's the way it is in God, or that we're saying this is an exceptional way, and that's just an arbitrary way of, just an arbitrary claim that this is an exceptional thing, it's just God, but nothing else. There's a reason why the persons in God are pure relations without substances, without being distinct substances, and that's because of the simplicity of God. It's the divine simplicity that calls for this pure relationality in the persons, okay? And so to be a pure relation is really proper to the being of an absolutely simple being, okay? The absolutely simple being that is God. So there would be concern that if you take pure relation and make that the characteristic note or even the definition of created personhood, you would be attributing to created persons something that's proper to divine personhood as divine, okay? That would be another kind of concern. There would be potentially a confusion between the created and uncreated order of reality or orders of reality. And then finally, there's a whole host of other concerns that are that go along with thinking about persons as pure relations, like relations without a substance of their own. And one example, just to give one example that we could give, and I will draw here from Karol Wojtyła, not necessarily from classical Thomism, but Karol Wojtyła is well known for the many times in which he said, each person, meaning a human person, finds himself in making a sincere gift of himself. So that's a good example of human relationality, making a complete gift of oneself or a sincere gift of oneself. In order to make a gift of myself, a sincere gift or a complete gift, I've got to somehow be someone in order to have someone to give. So if there's a substance there, if there's something to me prior to a relation with another, then I can enter into a relation with another and give myself to the other in relation in and through that relation to the person. Okay, but if there's no substance there to begin with, what exactly am I giving? And it becomes even more complicated when you start to get into his discussion about how the I within each subject doesn't really belong to me even to begin with. So how can it be given then? So there's a number of questions along these lines that we can raise. And I'm aware that I cannot do justice to these issues. They're just too big and too vast, but it's enough to sort of maybe start a conversation. And it's just an example of the sort of thinking and criticisms that followers of the School of St. Thomas have of some of the things Ratzinger has to say, especially this essay concerning the notion of person in theology. But for all that, there's a great deal of admiration for the man and for the thinker and the theologian, Benedict XVI. And I'll leave my remarks at that, and we can go on to questions.
All righty. Thank you very much, Father James. So before we go to questions from our audience here, and again, I invite everyone to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll be trying to pose them to our speakers. It seemed that maybe first it would be opportune to have the speakers comment on anything that stood out in one another's remarks. These are all issues that have been discussed that are, as you said here, Father James, regarding the issues of the person. These are profound and ongoing areas of consideration in our circles, and so before opening things up, I thought maybe Mark or Professor Crosby might like to say something, or Father James, if you had anything to say about what the others had said.
I was very grateful to Mark for his points about how Ratzinger was an opponent of the de-Hellenization. I think that has many, many implications, both in philosophy and in theology. And he made some Benedict XVI made some very important points about how the process of Hellenization, if you can even call it that, actually already begins in the scriptures. It begins even in the Old Testament. Like there's already a dialogue between faith and reason going on in the composition of the text of the scriptures themselves. That's a very, very important point.
Yes. By the way, Mark and Dr. Crosby, you all are both muted if you all want to free yourselves from that.
I was just waiting until I had said something. I had something to say to unmute.
Oh, well, you've already had much to say. Well, maybe as you all consider some remarks, let me offer one of the.
John Henry, if I could just on to Father James for a moment. It's interesting for me as a Jewish thinker to try and track Benedict's critique of the de-Hellenization of Christianity onto a similar question about Judaism. And I don't think it tracks as well in Judaism than it does in Christianity. Because I think the philosophical tradition is more developed and more systematic and more integrated in the Christian tradition, and specifically in Catholicism. So it strikes me that the rupture to Christianity would be much more profound with the project of de-Hellenization for Christian thought, or even more specifically for Catholic thought, than in Jewish thought. We have a philosophical intuition, but not the same degree of systematicity. And critics of Greek philosophy and Judaism would say exactly the kind of sort of mirror image of what Benedict is saying, that it's a good thing that Judaism doesn't have those layers of Hellenization. So it's just an interesting, this is where there is some, I think, real fruitful difference between the faiths, but where I think the commonality and what Benedict does so well is bring out the need for reason and the the kind of humanizing dimension of reason, without which we would fall back into force and brute, a Nietzschean will to power instead of reasoned discourse. And so there's something, the irony is that the Pope, to the eyes of the world, is seen as this religious parochial figure, but he's actually arguing more than any modern philosopher or thinker for the universality of reason.
He certainly is. It seems to me that, I agree with you on that a lot. When it comes to the claim that the interaction between Greek thought and Jewish thought is happening already in Scripture, yes, it definitely is happening a lot in the New Testament. You could say maybe predominantly in the New Testament, but even in Old Testament texts, I'm thinking of the Wisdom of Solomon and late sapiential literature. There's a thrust towards universalization there, and the appeal to reason within Judaism itself. I think Benedict XVI has something like that in mind. There's at least a little bit there. Yeah.
There's a question here, Father James, that I'll put to you, and it reiterates there's a number of questions maybe along these lines, but here's a question regarding the I'll just read a few of the lines here. It says, would you care to contrast your comments on Ratzinger's account on the notion of the person with that of John Paul II? As Wojtyła, he was also critical of what he called the cosmological reduction reflected in the Boethian definition of the person. He argued that it was adequate as a foundation for metaphysics, but not capable of offering an adequate account of the personal dynamism reflected in human action.
Sure.
If you can comment on that.
That's a good question. The Boethian definition of person is basically a nominal definition of person. It allows us to demarcate or distinguish persons from everything that's non-person, okay? But it's not the last word on personhood. And once we demarcate what persons are from the non-persons, then we can explore persons and we can say a lot more about them than is captured in the Boethian definition. Okay, that's the first thing to say. Second of all, when it comes to Karol Wojtyła in particular, he definitely had more Thomistic sorts of commitments. And although he thought there needed to be a reflection upon personal existence from a subjective point of view, from an interior point of view, from a personalist point of view, or pausing at the irreducible, as he would say, we know also that he had no problem with calling a human person a suppositum or a subject. And he does many times in Person and Act. There's a new edition, a new translation of Person and Act that just came out from the Catholic University of America. And this new translation makes it clear that John Paul II regularly uses the scholastic and Thomistic language of subject, substance, and suppositum when talking about persons. And we know also that in the school in Krakow, among the professors he was working with there, that they would regularly talk about reflecting upon the phenomenological aspects of my own substance. So that's how they would conceive their project, was not trying to replace talk of substance with something else, but to deepen our understanding of our own unique way of being substances, a personal way of being a substance. And one way you can understand that more deeply is by reflecting upon what they call the phenomenological aspects of my own substance. So I don't think Ratzinger would speak that way.
Professor Crosby, did you want to add anything on this, the topic of the essay on the notion of the person?
Yeah, no, I agree with most of the objections that Father raises to Ratzinger's thesis of that we have to replace the talk of substance with the more relational language. I would just say there are places in this essay where Ratzinger seems to avoid that excessive emphasis on relation. So, for instance, in one place he says, but such total being with the other. So he thinks that that's the structure of the person being related, that the person is with the other, not just anchored in himself. But such total being with the other does not cancel his being with himself, but brings it fully to itself. So there he sees that there's a polarity of the person dwelling with himself, returning to himself, belonging to himself, and transcending himself. And those two poles, the stronger the one, the stronger the other. The stronger the self-possession, the more radical the self-transcendence. So in some formulations, he, I think, is not far from a more balanced view of substance and relation than the one that he stresses here. But the other thing that I am struck by is that we have to preserve, of course, this anchorage of the person in his substantial center. But he adds something in the text that I was looking at that really shows how far reaching this dependence on the other is, and how significant relation is, when he says, as I pointed out, that I can't accept myself simply by turning into myself in solitude, but there is this gift that another has to be present, who loves me and gives me to myself by saying, it is good that you exist. So that is a significant relation whereby I receive something that I can't control, and only in that receiving can come to myself. So I'm certainly glad that Ratzinger's called attention to this dimension of relation and asking us to give it closer attention. That certainly will be very fruitful for the Christian personalism that we have here in the Hildebrand Project.
Mark or Father James, anything you want to say on that before we move on? I cut you off there, I think, Professor Crosby. You were about to say something.
No. I think if we're going to give our audience a chance to chime in, we need to do that now.
Yeah, well, we've been drawing from the questions that have been that have been posed here. There's another question that's interesting here. It hasn't really come up in our presentations, but I thought maybe I'd pose it to the panel, which is the comment here from someone who's a pastoral counselor and for whom Hildebrand's work on the heart has been of special interest, and wants to know if Ratzinger/Benedict's approach to the heart was in any way influenced by Van Hildebrand. I'm not personally aware of any direct influence, though he may have known books like The Heart. But Father James, when you and I were talking in preparation for this, you had said that you thought another theme that could be fruitfully explored with respect to the personalism of Pope Benedict would be this emphasis on the heart and on affectivity. So maybe I could draw you out a little bit on that.
Sure. Benedict XVI or has a lot to say about the heart. It's a very common notion in his own thought. He has a lot to say about it specifically in his book, Behold the Pierced One, where he lays out his Christology. And he talks about the heart. He talks about it in a way that's slightly different, or maybe significantly different from Van Hildebrand. For Van Hildebrand, the heart is the center of spirit, of affections, of higher affections, deep and profound and radical affections that are distinct from our sensory reactions to people and distinct from our willed responses. The heart has a life of its own and is abounding with these deep, profound affections, towards persons. So the emphasis in Van Hildebrand is on affection. Affection is sort of the proper activity of the heart. In Ratzinger, especially in Behold the Pierced One, but elsewhere as well, the heart is really the center of what he calls integration. So all the various elements of a human life and interior life come together and they coalesce and we become one person. And this coalescing of the various parts of our life, our thoughts and our affections and our choices, our experiences, our sufferings, our deeds, misdeeds, if the case may be, it all somehow is meant to come together in the heart. And the heart is the place where the person becomes one. So the heart is the center of integration. And that deserves an extensive study of its own. In fact, I know of a doctoral dissertation that was written recently on Ratzinger on the heart. And it's a topic that's really marvelous one. And I do see it, Ratzinger and von Hildebrand have something in common. They both want to place an emphasis on the heart and say that there's something in our Western anthropologies that has been lost by overlooking or forgetting the heart. They have that in common. But then when you ask, okay, what do you mean by the term heart? You get two different answers.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Professor Crosby?
No, that's well said in comparing a distinct focus on the heart in Hildebrand and in Ratzinger.
Yeah, so I would agree, and to those of our viewers who are interested in this, that this is a great there's a great kinship between the two, though the differences, as Father James has laid them out, are there. There's a respect in which that the heart in Hildebrand also is when he speaks of the heart as the sort of the core of the person, that something like that is in play, but it also has a sort of distinct set of functions as well. We are coming to the end of our time. I give one more invitation to people to add any questions here. There's some. I've tried to cover the questions that have been posed here, many of which are similar. There is a question here on humor, whether there's a connection. This is for you, Dr. Crosby, on humor in Benedict and in Van Hildebrand, and the concept and the emphasis on humor. And nothing comes to mind, in Van Hildebrand directly, other than that. And you as someone who knew him knew that he was a person of extraordinary humor and the kind of joy that flows from an overflowing humor, or the other way around. And he was a great storyteller, and I mean there was a great lightness of heart in him at times. But having since your remarks concluded with a conversation on humor and how humor is a sign of the presence of Christian faith and joy, I thought I would ask you about Van Hildebrand and humor.
Yes, well, he says some very profound things about humor in his aesthetics, and he speaks of how we gain a certain healthy distance to things when we can approach them with a certain humor, that instead of being taken over, overwhelmed and oppressed, we gain a certain distance and a certain lightness of heart, and a certain freedom is gained by that ability to approach the world and its tribulations with a certain humor. So that's one thing. In general, the aesthetics of Hildebrand would give a lot on that subject of humor and the relation between humor and joy. He sees that. So, yeah, that's and joy. This joy, often when Van Hildebrand speaks of a certain spirit of song in a person, he aims at the joy that fills a human heart. And so I would identify the aesthetics as a rich source for his thought. Not only he distinguishes the comical and the witty and clever jokes, but then there's this deeper humor that Ratzinger has in mind, And he says many wise and significant things about it in the Aesthetics.
Yeah. Well, as we come to our conclusion, maybe that can serve as your final reflection there, Dr. Crosby. But Father James or Mark, any final thoughts as we take our leave here?
I would just, as a Jewish man of faith, I have great gratitude to God for the person and thought of Benedict XVI, and he's a man that we desperately need in this confused, postmodern, post-reasoned age. And I think we should never forget that and remember his defense of the West, the best parts of the West, not the West in every single manifestation, but we need more fathers of the church like Benedict, and we'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to just thank the Hildebrand Project for putting this together. This is a great example of a kind of forum where people from different backgrounds and points of view can come together and talk in a way that often we don't do. We often talk about each other's positions, but less often talk to one another. So
Yeah.
This is great.
Yeah.
That's right. A spirit of true encounter. Well, I want to thank our speakers, and for all of you who participated. I want to, considering that Pope Benedict was one of our donors, I invite those of you who are here to consider supporting us. Events like this are, as we like to say, complimentary, not free. There's cost that goes into putting them on. So those of you who are able, we are always grateful for your support. We are also, of course, always grateful for your prayers and for your participation and for your contact with us, your suggestions of the work for the kind of programs that we do here. We're very interested in continuing this exploration of the work of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict. His passing creates an opportunity in which many people are revisiting his thought or going more deeply into it, and we see in him a great personalist, fellow traveler, despite the differences in his tradition from whether it be Van Hildebrand or the Thomistic tradition or other traditions. And yet we think also that there's a tremendous amount of to Mark's point just now about encounter, there's sort of a recognition of kinship, but there hasn't been maybe sort of deep exploration about what Van Hildebrand really has to say to a position, a Ratzingerian position or a Benedict position, and vice versa. There are a lot of people who know a great deal about Pope Benedict. Many of his students are still alive. I recall many years ago, Dr. Crosby, you were asked to be an advisor on a dissertation on Van Hildebrand that was being directed by a student of Pope Benedict who knew nothing about Van Hildebrand, but was very enthusiastic about the idea of the dissertation. So you were brought in to be that person. And we within the Hildebrand tradition have tremendous reverence for Pope Benedict and the works that we know. But I think that the Hildebrand Project has an opportunity to foster that encounter in a newer and deeper way. So we hope to do that, and hope that there will be more programming like this and more activities in the future that bring that conversation into focus. So I want to thank everyone again, our speakers, Professor Crosby, Father James, Rabbi Mark Gottlieb. Blessings to each of you, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Good evening.
You.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.